The story begins in a forested area filled with many testimonies about the creature known as Bigfoot. Everett and Marie are at home, discussing a necklace she seems to have found somewhere. Everett tries to assess how much they could get for the piece, but Marie says she wants to keep the ornament. When Everett steps out onto the porch, he hears leaves rustling in the yard, as if someone is sneaking around. He looks around, apprehensive, but sees nothing unusual. Just then, one of the lights in the yard suddenly goes out, only to come back on right away, and a strange noise begins to emanate from the darkness. Everett crouches down to grab something he can use to defend himself, and as he rises, he sees two shining points that seem to be staring at him. Soon they disappear as well, and Everett moves through the darkness until he reaches the faulty light. A much louder noise startles him, and he then sees the garbage cans knocked over. He tells Marie not to come out for now, but she doesn't hear him due to the loud music. Only when she goes to the kitchen does she notice her husband is missing and goes to the porch to look for him. Also disturbed by the darkness, she begins to ask if anyone is there, her voice trembling a little. By this time, Everett has ventured far from the house, and his flashlight goes out as the sound of very heavy footsteps begins to approach. By banging on the lantern, he manages to get it to work again and then shines the beam in various directions until he comes face to face with a hideous creature. Meanwhile, Marie is still on the porch, seemingly hypnotized by the glowing points. Everett arrives, terrified, and warns that it's time to run. To his astonishment, Marie responds that it's too late and insists that the creature is already inside her. Something suddenly grabs her, and Marie is dragged into the darkness. Moments later, we see a grotesque creature feeding on her. 10 years later, some young people gather for a group project that will help them complete their master's degree. Since the theme of the research is precisely Bigfoot, they will spend the weekend in a cabin deep in the forest where sightings are frequent. The boys are Jake and Oz, while the girls are Lily and Isabel. The fifth person is Chris, who has been dating Isabel for 2 months and decided to join her on the trip. Oz is the only one among them who seems to be a fan of the creature, while the others doubt its existence. Interrupting the conversation is the store owner named Harry. He starts a frightening speech about the terrible secrets of the forest and shakes his head at seeing that the customers don't believe him. Arriving at the cabin, Chris confesses to his girlfriend that he feels out of place among the students, but she says it's just an impression. Then the group meets Professor Dennis, and they all head out in search of clues about the famous monster. At one point, Oz suggests a curve off the trail, saying that Bigfoot probably doesn't respect this kind of route. Meanwhile, Lily meets a mysterious man who begins warning her about the dangers of the area in a strange tone that blends warning and threat. When he asks where she is staying, Lily doesn't answer and decides to move away from there quickly. Meanwhile, Jake becomes alarmed when he stumbles upon a skeleton. He and Isabel want to report it to the authorities immediately, but Oz convinces them to wait until Monday. After all, he and Professor Dennis have been preparing for this trip all semester. Oz also asks them not to tell the rest of the group to avoid unnecessary panic. When Jake and Oz walk away, Isabel notices that the skeleton is wearing a very beautiful necklace and decides to steal it. Away from the students, Dennis seizes the opportunity to take a drink and encounters Chris, who preferred to observe the birds during the expedition. He mentions that he had the impression of seeing something else moving, but it has already passed. That night, Chris finds a weapon in a drawer while looking for matches and shows it to Jake, who tells him not to touch it. We see that he was right to think he would feel out of place, as his attempts at jokes are catastrophic, and not even Isabel seems to tolerate him. Saying that she needs to talk to someone from work, she asks Jake for the car keys to go to a place with signal. Chris gets up to go with her, but she says it will only be a boring work conversation and suggests he stay there socializing. However, as soon as she leaves, everyone makes up an excuse too, and Chris ends up alone. In another room, Oz and Dennis toast to the success of the research. Oz asks if there could be anything more serious in that forest, and the professor replies that perhaps a bit of danger is needed for the young people to start questioning their beliefs. They continue talking, and when Oz mentions a commemorative date, Dennis suddenly stands up. Outside, Isabel is opening the car door when she hears a rustling and stops to look around, almost dying of fright when Dennis appears beside her, asking to accompany her. He explains that he forgot his own wedding anniversary and needs to speak to his wife to apologize. Very bored, Chris decides to choose a book to read and ends up picking a bizarre notebook. The pages are filled with scribbles and macabre drawings of a ghostly creature that looks nothing like Bigfoot. Some passages refer to this being as the fearsome Wendigo, and in one illustration, it appears offering a blue necklace to a young woman. According to the author of the notebook, the Wendigo only attacks at night, and dawn always brings peace back. In the bathroom, Lily is screaming at Jake through the door, refusing to let him use the toilet while she takes a shower. Suddenly, she hears a noise too close and realizes one of the windows is now open. She closes it again and goes to the cabinet to grab her things. Thinking Jake knocked on the door, she repeats her previous scolding, but then sees in the mirror that she is no longer alone in the bathroom. That mysterious man she met in the forest is right behind her, and he presses a cloth against her face before she can scream. On the road, Isabel can no longer stand hearing Dennis chatter about his marriage when something very strange happens. She sees what appears to be a woman alone, standing in the middle of the road. But when she asks Dennis who it might be, he reacts as if he sees nothing. To make matters worse, she doesn't see anything either when she looks again. Isabel tries to forget the incident and continues driving, but soon has another vision, this time taking Dennis's place right beside her. Distraught, she starts screaming and ends up crashing the car. She regains consciousness a few minutes later and sees that Dennis is still unconscious. Then, a shadow passes quickly behind the car, and a horrendous creature appears at the passenger window and begins to pound on the glass. Poor Dennis wakes up just as the window shatters and the grotesque arm grabs him by the neck, pulling his body out of the car. Completely overtaken by panic, Isabel scrambles out of the car, screaming. She realizes everything has become quiet again and starts to look around. There are the two glowing points in the darkness, staring intently at her. Isabel is almost entering a trance when a wailing soul suddenly appears with a terrifying scream. Then, an invisible force lifts her into the air and snaps her neck. Back at the cabin, Jake is listening to music, and Chris can't bear the urge to go to the bathroom any longer, still thinking that Lily is in the shower. Wearing a headlamp, he considers venturing outside, but someone throws an object against the door just as he peeks through the glass. He sees no one and the incident does not repeat itself, but even so, he prefers to grab the weapon from the drawer before leaving. As soon as he chooses a secluded spot to relieve himself, noises begin around him. First, it's the sound of leaves being stepped on and twigs snapping, but soon heavy footsteps can be heard walking toward him, and finally, a growl comes right behind his neck. Bigfoot grabs Chris as soon as he turns around, slamming his head against a tree before throwing him to the ground. The boy screams and tries to get up, but he is pulled by the legs and dragged away. Lying on the couch with headphones on, Jake hears nothing and is unaware that it's just him and Oz inside the cabin. At that moment, Lily is tied up and has tape over her mouth. When the mysterious man comes to talk to her, we discover that he is Everett. Explaining that the abduction is nothing personal, he reveals that he intends to use her as bait to capture and kill Bigfoot, as revenge for the loss of Marie. Jake wakes up in the morning to a knock at the door and finds Isabel in a catatonic state. She doesn't remember where the car went and says the professor is dead. Oz is very distressed by this, especially upon noticing that Chris and Lily have also disappeared. The three then begin to search for their friends in the forest, and Jake finds Chris's lantern. He is already fearing the worst when Chris starts screaming for help. He is trapped under several branches and logs, like an improvised cage. While Oz and Jake help him get out, he keeps repeating that he saw the creature. Then, Isabel shows the others where Professor Dennis is, or at least what's left of him. Now they are all mortified by what they've seen and afraid of what is to come. On top of that, Chris reveals that he dropped the weapon during the attack. Oz starts defending Bigfoot, who has always had a reputation for being harmless until this wave of disappearances in the area. He says the beast could have easily killed Chris. Since that didn't happen, it might have captured the boy to protect him from something else. Remembering the notebook, Chris mentions the Wendigo, and Oz freezes upon hearing that name, as his greatest fear was this. He explains that the Wendigo is a malevolent entity that feeds on selfish people, and unfortunately, Dennis was an example of that. Oz had already warned the professor about the rumors that something even worse lurked in that forest, but he didn't want to cancel the trip and risk his position at the university. Hearing all of this, Jake is shocked by the revelation that Bigfoot not only exists but is also a hero compared to the other inhabitant of that same forest. Oz's plan is to walk to that store, where there is cell signal, before the Wendigo finds them. As soon as he says this, Isabel starts choking and says the Wendigo is already coming. In the woods, Everett ties Lily to a tree, indifferent to her screams. He even says it's better this way, as Bigfoot will come faster. After he walks away, Lily discovers that she is not the first he has used as bait and is horrified to see what happened to the previous one. In the middle of the night, Isabel wakes up and sees the glowing points inside her room. They disappear when she turns on the light, which makes her decide to leave it on. But as soon as she lies down, the light turns off by itself. We see that her shadow on the wall has enormous horns, and then her tablet starts to manifest, reading macabre phrases. Suddenly, the screen turns into a mirror and her reflection seems to have a life of its own, laughing at her fear. Then the lights begin to flicker uncontrollably while Isabel's body contorts horrifically, and her image on the screen laughs louder and louder. When the phenomenon ceases, she covers herself with the blanket and stays as quiet as possible. Hearing a sound of burning wood, she starts to pull the blanket off very slowly. Then, something hastens the movement, yanking the blanket away from her, and an evil being appears floating just inches from her face, and Isabel's eyes go vacant. Meanwhile, Everett observes Lily through the gun's sight, ready to take down the monster. The leaves on the ground begin to rustle right behind him, and he decides to turn the lantern in that direction. Seconds later, he looks again and sees several hideous creatures ready to attack him. Still bound to the tree, Lily hears his screams and becomes even more terrified. She is trying to free herself when one of the abominations appears in the brush, disappearing shortly after. Lily manages to free herself from the bindings, and while running, she trips over Everett's remains during her escape. Hearing a disgusting chewing sound, she tightly closes her eyes and trembles in fear. One of the creatures comes out from behind the trees and passes very close to her, but doesn't bother her. When silence returns, she opens her eyes and resumes her frantic escape. Oz is talking to Jake when they both hear Isabel's screams, but discover that she is not in the room. Oz checks under the bed, not seeing her hiding on top of the wardrobe, right behind him. Then the bedroom door slams open, and Isabel appears on the other side of the bed, with a demonic expression. He hears her bones breaking as she begins to crawl toward him. Just as Oz threatens to crush her, her voice returns to normal and convinces him that the danger has passed. But then the entity regains control and says she is very hungry, lunging for him afterward. Jake is still searching for his friend when Chris hears a strange sound of glass cracking and goes to pull the curtains. To his horror, one of the creatures is banging its head against the glass of the window, which is about to break. He quickly steps back and closes the door just as Lily enters the cabin. The two meet, and she warns him that it's time to get out of there. Jake is discovering the same thing, but in a more dramatic way. Stepping out onto the back porch, he sees dozens of hideous beings screeching horribly and walking toward the cabin. Terrified by the scene, he only sees Isabel standing right behind him when it's already too late. Meanwhile, Lily hands a shovel to Chris and repeats that it's time to flee, but he refuses to leave without his girlfriend. Lily says there's no time for this kind of heroism and tells Chris he's a clown just trying to please everyone. Visibly offended, he only asks to check the rest of the house before leaving. Lily agrees, a bit regretful for the unprovoked attack. Armed with the shovel, Chris begins to roam the rooms of the cabin until he reaches the kitchen, where he hears a chilling sound of sucking. He tiptoes to the porch door and catches his girlfriend bent over Jake's trunk, in the middle of a meal. Realizing his presence, she lifts her head and reveals her transfigured face before letting out a deafening screech. She lunges at him, but Chris manages to close the door just in time. Lily decides to help in the search and goes to Isabel's room, where a hideous being begins screeching at her too. She rapidly slams the door shut and hears the thing pounding on the wood on the other side. Chris regains his composure and starts looking for Lily when a double door opens behind him, and something pulls him into a closet. He feels relieved to see that it's Lily herself, covering his mouth so he doesn't attract the Wendigo's attention. Speaking softly, she says the creatures are now inside the house, and the two then observe through the cracks in the door. Some of the beings enter the room and begin to search for their victims, until one stops and stares fixedly at the closet. The thing begins to approach slowly but ends up getting distracted by a noise and changes direction. Then another one suddenly appears in the doorway, staring at the party much more closely. However, after a few moments, it shakes its head and walks away. Chris and Lily wait a moment before leaving their hiding spot and then walk as quietly as possible down the hallway. Reaching the street door, they see that one of the monsters is right in the middle of the living room, and any noise might alert it. Lily manages to turn the latch very discreetly, but Chris drops the shovel with a loud clatter. The creature begins to screech, and the two are forced to separate to escape. While Lily exits the cabin, Chris runs up the stairs and locks himself in one of the rooms. He immediately realizes he made the wrong choice when he sees the look of horror on Oz's face, who is being devoured. He tries to carefully maneuver around the scene but fails once again, attracting the monster's attention in the process. Running into the next room, he leaps through the window and falls into the garden, surprised to see Lily waiting for him. She explains what happened to her since she was abducted and says the plan now is to flee in Everett's pickup truck. They go to the body to grab the keys, and Lily can only find them when a pack of creatures is already nearly upon them. The two run away, not realizing that the evil entity is possessing Everett. Chris and Lily try to hide, but the creatures catch up to them and grab both. One of them bites Lily's shoulder, and she begins to scream in despair. Once again, Chris is spared for no apparent reason, but Lily doesn't make it. Devastated by the loss and surrounded by the creatures, he begins to scream and sob until he hears a familiar sound. It's the footsteps of Bigfoot echoing through the forest. The beast stops behind Chris for a brief moment, but then it goes around him and continues walking. The head of the evil entity now appears between the trees, and Bigfoot seems to be heading toward it. However, the other creatures are still scattered in the way, and the beast begins to deal with them first, crushing all of them in no time. The entity starts losing its form as its minions fall in the battlefield, and finally, only the 2 points remain, which soon also extinguish. The day is already dawning when Chris escapes running, frantically pressing the control for the pickup truck until he hears the beep of Everett's vehicle. However, as soon as he sits behind the wheel, Isabel throws herself against the hood. He begins to think of all the moments she let him down, and this daydream distracts him until he sees she's vanished. This is because she is right beside him and begins to climb through the window while trying to grab him. Chris leaps out the other side and crawls up to the truck's bed. Isabel keeps moving closer to him until Chris douses her in gasoline, and by lighting a match, he finally defeats the possessed girlfriend by burning her. To ensure his victory, he runs the vehicle over the abomination. Bigfoot passes by one last time but does not interact with Chris. The only problem now is that the truck won't start. He nearly despairs over this, but soon discovers that it was a stroke of luck, as the pickup explodes the moment he gives up and walks away. He begins to distance himself, leaning on the shovel when Everett's voice begins to hum. Upset about the fate of the pickup, he begins to tell Chris his saga, showing him the blue necklace. He admits that his revenge went off the rails and that many of his actions may have been influenced by the Wendigo. In the end, he says none of this matters because he is very hungry. He resumes humming and approaches at the same pace until he gets very close. Chris doesn't think twice before attacking him with the shovel. Everett's head keeps humming, but that doesn't bother him much. Chris continues to limp down the road until a car appears. We see that the driver is Harry, who seems to be used to giving rides to people in this condition.